program as I launch forward and continue onward with my goal of conducting broadcasting Monday through Friday, 12 noon to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And today I am also filling in for Hal Shurtleff, who is the host at Camp Constitution Radio, which is heard at Podomatic and other venues. Hal asked me as a favor. Unfortunately, I don't know how to use this system, which is not atypical for me, I have to admit. And so I'm not able to get onto his talk shoe. And as such, I am doing the program through my own system, and I will send it to him when I'm done. I hope that that's going to be good enough. You can never tell. You know, I will admit that when it comes to internet radio, I can be very inept, and I certainly don't deny that. But nevertheless, I shall forge forward. You're welcome to join the program, 617-396-4958. And my good friend Hal Shurtleff is the director of Camp Constitution in New Hampshire. It's a family camp which combines typical camp activities, sports and boating and swimming, with constitutional education. They have classes every day, and particularly good for young people, for teenagers who want to get a real experience orienting themselves toward what America is about, what our founding principles are, what our Constitution says, something that most young people don't know. You know, our Constitution is a very simple document to read. It could be read by any high school student. It really is amazing. And yet you find that it's scarce in public schools. Most of our young people don't understand it, but they don't read it. And for a long time, I and many others have advocated that high schools are required to have civics as one of the topics of their curriculum, where young people, actually high school age and even younger, actually have the opportunity to read the Constitution, discuss it, study it, write essays on it, think about it, and delve into the nature of our constitutional system, and as such, our constitutional way of life. Something that is particularly and acutely, may I add, necessary today, given the level of seizure, the level upon which we're under siege, might be a more accurate depiction. So Hal mentioned to me that in advance, and I would do this anyway, because I do a news-driven program, that I discuss the debacle undergone in Afghanistan. And I thought that I would do a bit of an overview on this. For starters, in a weird, sort of an indirect way, as horrifying as this is, and it's going to get worse, believe me, it's ugly. You have the extremist Taliban now apparently going door to door, looking at people's apps to see if they're Christians, see if they have any affiliation with America. And the fact that the establishment media is trying to cover its backside by claiming that the Taliban is a new Taliban, really? The fact is that this is a horrendous disaster. It is one of the stupidest blunders, or at least we think it's a blunder, and I'm going to look at that a little more deeply. But by all intents and purposes, it is a blunder in the real sense. I don't think that militarily there has been a bigger miscalculation and blunder than this, going all the way back to Hannibal, the Carthaginian general who tried to sack Rome by driving elephants across the Strait of Gibraltar and up through France and then down into the Italian Alps and the Apennines. And, they got stuck. I mean, elephants can't do that kind of terrain. They ended up getting stuck. And even though he did terrorize Italy and terrorize the Romans, in the bigger picture, he lost, and he lost big. It was not long after that disaster that Carthage was completely destroyed. Now, I'm not saying that the United States is going to we're going to face a Carthaginian solution here, but the blunder of this withdrawal is on that scale, and it could get a lot worse. So it raises a broader question of whether or not the United States should have been involved there at all. And the silver lining, the one good thing, as horrible as this is, if we understand it in a context, is that this is a complete defeat of the internationalist, globalist, Wall Street illuminated ruling class who had propped up a regime there for 20 years at great expense to the rest of us deplorables. People on a strictly financial level, I mean, people in Washington got very rich from the Afghanistan war. But more significantly, on a political level, it was a continuation of this internationalist agenda of empire building, of creating a new world order, if you will, and of kind of a top-down control that apparently, or at least from what we can tell, has been defeated, but you can never tell what they're really doing, what they're really thinking. Maybe they deliberately wanted to do this. Maybe they hoped that this would happen. But what we do know, regardless of the inner workings of the elite, and I'm not suggesting that it's uniformal, that they all think alike, but what we can maybe discern in the obvious is that this is a debacle for them, the fact that this has happened. And even though there is now evidence coming out that they had expected this to happen, but let's assume, for the sake of argument, that they did expect this to happen and that they were willing to risk their reputation, which is very fragile, as the controllers of the American government right now. What have they done? I mean, they've handed over umpteen billions of dollars in American military hardware and software. And I'm talking like real stuff, Black Hawk helicopters, tanks, advanced technology, military technology. They just left it on the field. They abandoned it. They abandoned Bagram Air Base, just simply packed up shop and left in an inexplicable blunder. I mean, this was it was the most secured and fortified spot in Afghanistan. There was no reason to ever abandon it. And yet they did. They just handed it basically de facto over to the enemy. And so you have the complete collapse of this regime. You have the takeover by the Chinese and Russian and Iranian embassies and governments, their embassies were not in any way affected. You have China essentially taking control over American military hardware and building the belt, the Silk Road, if you will, which is going to now pass between China through Afghanistan, Iran, and Turkey, thus giving them de facto control over the Asian subcontinent. Now, we don't understand the machinations between that and Russia. Maybe they were in competition, maybe they were in cahoots, we don't know. But what we do know is that we, as America, is out of the picture. Now, what does that say to America's position in the international order? It's very damaging. But, and even though I start the conversation and people may think I'm engaging in a contradiction here, I don't think we should be into the international order. The fact is that we are into it. And this is a setback for us. And it does basically create a power vacuum for others who may seek to enhance their position. It means that we have not stood by our allies, and that puts at danger Taiwan. In fact, China immediately released publicly released on their communist apparatus a direct threat to Taiwan. Look what America did to their ally in Kabul. You're next. Watch out. You know, this puts into the crosshairs any nation that is confronting Chinese hegemony. And it is a huge victory for the communist Chinese in the present world structure, which is world order. We have been enmeshed in this world order ever since World War I. So that's a reality. Now, we could talk in a purist way and in the broad sense in that we should get out of this internationalist order. We should protect American interests, hand an olive branch to our allies and engage in trade and maybe some alliances that can be renewed. But for the most part, end our international intervention and let other nations function within the context of their own sovereignty. This evil regime in Afghanistan, they have a right to, the Afghani people have a right to whatever regime they choose to have. It's sad to see terrorists take over, but we cannot be involved forever in policing every country. You know, we would be there for another 40 years with loss of American life, with loss of American treasure, and then we would withdraw and the same thing would happen. I mean, these are terrorists. This is a country that has never been subdued by any foreign nation, going all the way back to Alexander the Great. Why would we think we could do this, and why would we do it? I don't think we were ever really wanted there. And as evil as this regime is, we have to respect their right to be what they are and to hope for the help of the people without occupation, without war, to liberate themselves from it. And I think that they would eventually, because eventually such an evil regime that is so authoritarian is inevitably going to implode on its own rot, because its means of functioning is contrary to human nature. People are not going to put up with it, ultimately. Women are not going to put up with it, of being told they can't go to school, and they have to walk around with this headgear covering their entire body as if they're moving telephone booths. Men are beheaded if they step outside the regime. I just don't think that a totalitarian society like that is going to be able to function. It's not going to be able to survive. It's that simple. So in a way, the better approach was the same approach that we took to the Soviet Union, to the communists. Ronald Reagan disintegrated the Soviet Union without firing a shot, simply by refusing to engage with them. He enhanced the the CFR Keenan containment program, which was never really that strong. It kind of was filled with a lot of loopholes. And he basically, without war, he simply strengthened our allies surrounding the Soviet Union. He cut off any, he brought business people. I mean, a good source on this is Judge Clark. Judge, I think his name is James Clark. He was a domestic advisor to Reagan, and he came up with this strategy. Basically, they called into the White House business leaders and told them and asked them, as a matter of patriotism, not using government force, but within the context of the Constitution, they asked them, as a matter of patriotism, to not sign any new agreements with Russian companies and not do business with the Soviet Russians, to tighten the screws on Russia, to enforce the agreements they already had, to allow them to expire, to not do anything extra, and to just gradually withdraw from those agreements. He also used very public comments, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, contrasting that atheistic, authoritarian, illuminated social experiment with the vastly superior American system based on Judeo-Christian values and belief in God, based on institutions that promote freedom, like private ownership of property, like faith, like family, like free expression, free trade domestically, entrepreneurialism, all of the things that make America great. And he showed how that system was superior to the authoritarian leftist system that was what Russia was, that the American people were more successful, they were more free, they were happier, they lived longer, there was more invention, more actualization, more creativity. It was just superior in every sense, because in America, we understood that rights come from the creator and not from the state, that the individual grants limited authority to the government instead of the other way around. And he articulated that quite well. He also encouraged our allies to do the same by forming a spiritual alliance with people like Pope John Paul II, who went to Poland, his native Poland, held a public mass that was attended by more people than at any other single event in human history. It was almost 1 million Poles attended this mass. I mean, from like 50, 60 miles around. I mean, it was just the most extraordinary public event in history. And that led to the collapse of the artificial leftist regime in Poland eventually. He also allied himself with Margaret Thatcher of England, of Václav Havel, the playwright from Czechoslovakia, and other freedom-minded people. And he began to broadcast these ideas into Russia. This is what eventually led to the collapse. It wasn't war. There wasn't military occupation. Yes, we made the one mistake of helping the Mujahideen defeat, the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Okay, maybe that was, look, I'm not a purist, and maybe that was necessary, even though it did give birth to bin Laden, and it backfired. And it bled the Russians on the battlefield. But the final coup de grace was toward the end of the Reagan administration. And by the way, you want to talk about election Russian collusion and interference. Look at what Peter Schweitzer wrote about Ted Kennedy and his attempt to work with the Russians to defeat Reagan in the 1984 election. Let's put that aside. In 1987, around that time, Reagan went to Russia, where he spoke at a church He talked about belief in God and Christ. He spoke publicly about the miseries of the Russian people, and there was an uprising over this. The Russians couldn't control him. They couldn't craft his message sort of the way that the big tech tries to do now to patriots in this country. We could look at that. But anyway, the point is that he was able to use his bully pulpit, his platform, his great speech in Berlin, tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev. These things had a huge impact psychologically, spiritually, morally on the people of Russia. And, the result was that the Russians, that combined with a very couple of simple things like that McDonald's was allowed to open in Moscow, and people were lining up for hours to get what any average American could get in a matter of 5 minutes, including people who are relatively below the poverty line, could get a meal at McDonald's for themselves and their families for, a very modest price. In Russia, they had to wait in line. They couldn't even get they couldn't even get good potatoes for the French fries, so they had to import them because the Russian potatoes were so lousy. They couldn't get products. They couldn't get good meat. I mean, the country had nothing. It was on its knees, and it was that brought these little things brought to mind the corruption, the emptiness, the falseness, and the evil of the communist system. Another final straw, frankly, was, and this is something we could learn from in this country right now. I don't want to go into too much detail because I'm live on YouTube, but the Chernobyl catastrophe, the nuclear catastrophe, which sent nuclear clouds all over Europe. It's an absolute disaster. The Russians did what they had always done. First, they tried to hide it, and they didn't mention it for several weeks while the radiation was pouring out. Eventually, when they could no longer hide it because it was too obvious, they then tried to blame the United States. Oh, this is American sabotage and that kind of stuff. And they wove really nasty conspiracy theories. And the thing is that the Russian people at that point had been fed such a diet of lies and deceptions and falseness for so many decades that nobody believed them anymore. They had lost their credibility. It's kind of like the regime now telling us things about the pandemic and referring to them as, quote, misinformation, unquote. Now we find out that they're true. People are going to start to wake up. I don't want to get into details about that because these are still topics that are being banned. Eventually, I believe that's going to change. But the point I'm making in the broader sense is that the whole rotten, miserable, evil edifice collapsed on its own weight, on its own contradiction. Now, I'm not here to praise Putin. I think Putin is authoritarian, clearly. I will say, however, that he is extremely popular in Russia and that there's no comparison between Putin and the Soviet socialists. I mean, Putin is still a man of the left. He was a former KGB agent, after all. He understands the authoritarian nature of the left, but he's not as far left as Stalin or as Brezhnev. The Soviet Union has changed. Putin does allow for freedom at a much higher level, that people believe in God again. There is more human rights there, at least comparatively. And Russia is much more in control. Now you have the corruption with the oligarchs, of course, but and we learned a little bit about that with how they can corrupt Western leaders. We learned about that from the Ukraine scandal with the Biden with Biden as vice president. Again, a subject we can't get into here because this is censored. This is YouTube. That's always out there. There's always an element of corruption. And these are countries that don't have the kind of Western traditions that seem to, in many cases, not all, but often at least somewhat check and balance that level of corruption with independent judiciaries and independent departments of justice and independent businessmen competing with each other and local government and all of this whole incredible system of checks and balances that we have that at least contain the corruption. At least there's a chance to keep it, dissipated and keep it in different silos and keep it competing so that sometimes the good guy can come out on top. We do have, relatively speaking, in this imperfect universe, a system that does, generally allow for, the truth to come out and for justice to be served. Russia has moved in that direction. And so back to the broad point, that could have been, should have been, coulda, woulda, shoulda, the approach to Afghanistan. We didn't have to go invade and put thousands of men and women in service at risk and spend $1 trillion and risk all of our hardware. We could have simply said, look, we're not going to do business with you. You can, if you want to be this evil to your own people, go ahead, but we're not cooperating with this. We are not going to allow it. And if Russia wants to go in or China wants to go in and occupy, good, pox in their house. Let it be on their hands. These regimes, look, I don't think that, if you let these power regimes work their way out, they're not going to last forever. I mean, I think it was none other than Harry Truman, just before Pearl Harbor, during the period when, after Hitler betrayed Stalin in Operation Barbarossa, June of 1941, when he launched a full-scale invasion of Russia, Harry Truman, senator from Missouri, and others, both Democrat and Republicans, nothing to do with it. He was like, fine, the two most evil empires in the world, let them duke it out. Let them exhaust each other. Let them have their war. We should stay out. And I think that would have been the best policy. I mean, they probably are entering into it, only prolonged it, and it probably allowed for it only radicalized Germany even more with regard to things like the Nazi Holocaust. If we had just let them duke it out, let them have it. I mean, so Germany conquers Russia. Great. What are they going to do with it? I mean, it's like, this whole idea of this physical world empire is false. It's not going to last because it's contrary to human nature. It's as people aren't going to put up with it. The idea of the sovereignty of nations is natural to who we are. And you have to have faith that that's going to work itself out, and that the best thing the United States, I think, could have done, and we could go back to World War I on this one, would have been to simply serve as a neutral arbiter of conflict, as a diplomatic office, offering our services to nations to help them work out their conflict. But if they can't, then they can't. Let them expend their war locally and let them work it out. But we should have stayed out. We should have had a strong military to defend our borders, to defend both coasts against possible invasion. If someone attacks us, attack them back with both fists, but don't stay into a prolonged war. And I think that was undone by those who believed in creating a new world order and becoming a part of this internationalist movement. It was fueled both by Wall Street, who wanted to internationalize their financial powers and further concentrate wealth in their hands, and socialistic dreamers, political, who want to create a worldwide utopia. anyway, I'm sorry I couldn't get on live with Hal Shurtleff's program. I just screwed up the coordinates, but I wanted to keep it to a half an hour. So I think on that note, I'm going to thank you for joining me. Charles Moskowitz, filling in for Hal Shurtleff, Camp Constitution. If you want to check out Camp Constitution, go to their website, just look them up. They're in New Hampshire. It's an excellent week for your teenage children to get a great experience, both in terms of good old-fashioned summer camp, but also daily courses in the US Constitution and in patriotism and all of the things that you don't get in school. And they also are running, I think, a family camp now where, the whole family, adults and children, can go up there and spend a week. I mean, it's a great, great system. I have visited there. I have spoken there. Hal Shurtleff's a friend of mine. Check it out. So it's campconstitution.com. And I want to thank you all for joining me this afternoon. God bless you all. Charles Moskowitz, Monday through Friday, 12 noon. And have a great